Good afternoon. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And hopefully none of you had that chocolate cake, so you're not going to fall asleep this afternoon, right? I'm delighted to be able to talk about some of my favorite places in North Carolina this afternoon. And we have an entire session focusing on the Bay Lakes of Bladen County and Columbus County in the North Carolina coastal plain. My partners in crime today are individuals who are serving as advisors for a White Lake Science Advisory Group that we have started. And so they're able to review data and make suggestions for monitoring and special projects and things. And so first on the list is Mike O'Driscoll with East Carolina University. He's a groundwater and nutrients guy. Nathan Hall with University of North Carolina. Rob Richardson, NC State Aquatic Weed Program. And Linda Ehrlich with Spirogyra Diversified Environmental Services. Linda and I were in grad school together a long time ago, and we both worked on the Chuan River, which was a big project for WRRI back in the day. So,
thanks so much, Diane. So I hope everyone is excited about Bay Lakes now. And what I was going to do, since this is a lightning talk, I've been told to go through these like lightning. So what I was going to do is just cover some of the other interesting studies. Diane sort of alluded to some of the older hydrology work. And so we'll kind of go through. Interesting thing is most of these they're called Carolina based because most of them are concentrated in the Carolinas. So a lot of this work is going to be either from South Carolina or North Carolina. Let's see, I'm plopping already. This thing is, all right, now I got it. So the first top picture of a bay up there is a site they studied really intensively. It was one of the earliest sites studied looking at lake groundwater interactions, Thunder Bay in South Carolina. It's at the Savannah River site. And so this site has a lot of Carolina bays, and they've done a lot of really good work there. What was interesting to me, because I did this sort of work as a grad student, putting hundreds of piezometers in and around lakes. And so they kind of made Swiss cheese of this poor Carolina Bay, but they really got to understand the hydrology very well. And one common point, some of these are a little bit smaller than the big lakes we're talking about, but it's a little bit more manageable to really instrument them. So a lot of the detailed work comes from these smaller studies. What they found is the water levels were really strongly controlled by the precipitation excess. So if you look at the amount of precip you get minus the evapotranspiration, and so that's the water that's kind of left over to feed these lakes. And when they look at the lake level change, they could see a pretty good relationship. And so the outliers that are higher than that line are sort of showing that you're getting more groundwater in, and then lower, it's showing that you're getting some groundwater losses. And so this is kind of a common theme when we look along the Carolina Bay studies, is that precipitation minus evapotranspiration is a major control on those levels. And then they're typically groundwater fed also. So these were some of their detailed transects looking at these piezometers in and around the lake. And they're able to tell something about the groundwater inputs. And another common theme is that these are really seasonally variable depending on the precip minus ET occurring in that particular area. And so what we see across a lot of these studies is that they're dynamic systems. They're really influenced by recent rainfall. And when you try to categorize them as a certain lake type, it kind of falls apart because they behave like different types of lakes depending on the recent meteorological conditions. In this case, they could show during wetter conditions, flow through systems where the higher hydraulic head on the up gradient side of the system is forcing groundwater into the lake, and then it's flowing out on the lower side of it. So it's kind of a flow through lake system during wet conditions. And then when it's pretty dry, what typically happens is the surface water in the lake is seeping down through the sediments. So it's kind of acting like a groundwater recharge area. So they can behave differently depending on the recent meteorological conditions. But one thing that'll become important when we look at some of the bigger lake studies is sometimes the groundwater source areas they're feeding these lakes, it can be very asymmetrical depending on the superficial aquifer characteristics and the elevations there. So you can have one area that's feeding groundwater to the lake, and on the other side of the lake, you're losing surface water to the groundwater system. This was another interesting study at the Savannah River site. They looked at 86 of these isolated wetlands. And basically, they visited these 15 times from 96 to 98. And they recorded every time these lakes or ponds had water in them, right? And so one of the interesting things they found was basically the bigger lakes, the bigger ponds, were more likely to be inundated, right? And so it kind of showed that these are the ones that are more likely to stay wet year round. They have a longer hydro period. They were doing this study for ecological reasons to look at amphibian diversity in these. And what they found is there's a link between longer hydro periods and more diverse amphibian populations. So that was kind of neat. This other study by Sun et al., they did a detailed hydrological budget of this Chapel Bay, also in South Carolina. And same kind of thing, they're showing precip and ET is very important. And then there's some groundwater inputs to the system. And sometimes you're losing groundwater, and sometimes you're having surface water overflows from the system. But what was most interesting, and it kind of helps to explain some of the ideas that what can be important to these systems, if they hold water or they don't hold water, can be related to subsurface confining layers. And so they noticed some at the sites, and a lot of the Carolina Bay studies will notice these confining units underneath the lake system, so that can help them hold water. What they did, it was kind of neat with their hydrological data. Then they ran some different model scenarios, and they did one confining unit that sort of mimicked the land surface topography. So that's case one. They did another one with a flat one right under the lake. And then they had another one that had a reverse slope to the land surface. And so the case one, when you have a pretty consistent subsurface layer, they were finding good, strong groundwater inputs into the lake. And then for the other two, not so much, related to where the confining unit is and how it's oriented. And then the last one I'll talk about real quick is a nice study on White Lake by Shankins and Mora. And they used some groundwater hydraulic head data and developed a model. And what was real important is the asymmetrical groundwater source area around the lake. So up on the north side of the lake, where there's higher topography, the hydraulic head patterns were such that it was flowing through that part of the lake. Groundwater is flowing in from that area, and then it's discharging on the other side of the lake. So this becomes important when you look at where the groundwater that's feeding the lake is coming from. So it's kind of asymmetrical, like they've shown in other studies. So just looking kind of more broadly at this area, kind of some of the differences in drainage. So you have White Lake, which is permanently inundated. And then you have a lot of bays that typically are just seasonally inundated. The other thing that's happened too, right, related to development in the intercoastal plain is ditching and draining of some of these bays. So you can see that example of the farm there. And then urban development, like Diane mentioned on the fringes. So I'll just wrap it up here real quick. When you look at seepage lakes, we can look at different types: gaining, losing, flow through. And Carolina bays, depending on the recent meteorological conditions, they can have each category of this behavior depending on the recent situation. Most of them, precip and ET is very important to their water levels, and then shallow groundwater inputs. And then last, just tying in some of the links with hydrology and lake water quality. Rainfall is very important to these systems, so atmospheric deposition can be a source. When you look at managing the groundwater non-point source pollution inputs, it's important to understand that groundwater source area to the lakes. And I better finish up because this is a lightning talk. So thanks very much for your attention.
Okay, next up is Nathan.
Okay. So I was interested in looking at how nutrients are changing in the Bay Lakes, and then also asking the question, are the trends we see in nutrients within these lakes consistent with atmospheric deposition being an important source of those nutrients? So I kind of set this up as an experiment looking across all of the coastal plain of North Carolina. If you look across the coastal plain, you'll see there's like 3 sets of Bay Lakes. One is that southeastern part of North Carolina that we're pretty much talking about here in this session, but there's also another set that's in the Croatan National Forest in Carteret and Craven and Jones counties. And then farther up in the northeast corner on the Albemarle Peninsula, there's also New Lake, Punga Lake, Phelps, and Matamesquite. So if atmospheric deposition is important in changes in nutrients, we would expect to see the strongest signal in the southeast corner where the hot spot of atmospheric deposition is. So that's kind of the setup. So gotta take this thing out or make it taller or something. There we go. Okay, so I looked at these lakes in the southeastern part, and then what I'm calling the central region, and then the northeastern region. And this is all the lakes that had data spanning more than like 3 or 4 years. This is really all the data that there was within the Division of Water Resources, and also included data from the Weiss and Kunstler study to take it back into the 70s. Well, you can see with White Lake, total nitrogen, starting about the year 2000, we see this really steep increase. And we see that same kind of pattern in Waccamaw. We see the same thing in Jones Lake, Singletary Lake, Salters Lake. Baytree Lake is that weird lake that Diane talked about, that back in the early 60s and early 70s, there was this huge disturbance where they raked up the bottom. So it looks like maybe, anyway, over the long term, Baytree Lake hasn't had a big increase, but within like the last 20 years, it looks just like all the other lakes. From about 2000 on, in that southeast corner, they've all gone up. Within the central region, Catfish Lake and Great Lake have shown modest increases in total nitrogen. And then Phelps Lake on that northeastern corner is basically no change in total nitrogen. Matamesquite, however, is a huge change. Matamesquite is another oddball Bay Lake. Unlike the other ones that don't have much of a watershed, Matamesquite has ditches that flow into it, and the farmers around there have deeded rights to dump their unwanted water from their fields on into Matamesquite. So it's a little different. And we know that agriculture inputs from this ditching are really important there. So it's a little bit different. I also want to mention this is total nitrogen. I'm showing almost all of these. This is almost without exception. All of this is due to organic forms of nitrogen. There's very little nitrate, very little ammonia in these Bay Lakes. They have really long residence times. There's plenty enough time for algae and other microbes to assimilate and change all the inorganic stuff to organic. So if we exclude Matamesquite, which again was an oddball lake, and we look from that period where all of the southeastern corner lakes started showing that big increase. So like if we look at the mean of the 1990s and compare that to the mean in 2010s, which is what I've done here, we do see this geographic trend of really strong increases at that southeastern corner going to weak trends in the northeastern corner. So it is consistent for nitrogen with what we'd expect if atmospheric deposition was driving these changes in the Bay Lakes. I'm not sure how much time. How am I doing on time? Doing all right? Okay. Total phosphorus, really, there weren't many trends. There's not a whole lot to say. The central lakes seem to be going up a little bit, maybe a little bit of increase in some of the southeastern Bay Lakes. This is a little hard. It's a little harder to tell with total phosphorus because some of the method detection limits have changed a lot over time. So it's hard to tell if what you're seeing is a real trend or just changes the method detection. And really that geographic pattern that we saw that looked pretty strong for the lake, for the data that we have for total nitrogen, really wasn't apparent for total phosphorus as far as that geographic pattern. Even though Diane's data did show that there was some phosphorus in the rainwater, oftentimes phosphorus there's usually not a lot of phosphorus in atmospheric deposition. In fact, in most like modeling studies and stuff, they don't even include phosphorus in the rainwater. So yeah, in conclusions, that it looks like that gradient of change that we've seen, it is consistent with atmospheric deposition of nitrogen being the source driving those changes. But then, there are obviously some other influences. For madder mesquite, for example, there's no way you can attribute all that change to atmospheric deposition. We know that agricultural inputs from all these ditches going into are really important. And Bay Tree Lake, with the bottom getting ripped up, and its earlier part shows that these kind of big perturbations can also affect nutrients.
Okay, next up is Rob.
Okay, thank you, Diane. So just a quick primer on hydrilla for anybody that might not be familiar with it. It's been called the perfect aquatic weed because it does grow so well in the US. In terms of damages and range, it is the #1 aquatic weed in the US. Pretty easy to identify in North Carolina. It has leaves and whorls of typically 4 or 5, but that can vary. Serrated leaf margins, the serrations are visible to the naked eye. The difficult thing about hydrilla, though, is that it produces subterranean turions, which we usually call tubers. Once those are in the sediment, they can persist for over 7 years. They don't all sprout at once. So once you have a tuber bank established on a site, you're talking about typically having hydrilla there for the long term. It is extremely shade tolerant, and it has been documented to produce, one single plant can produce 262 feet of linear shoot tissue in 35 days. It's in warm water and obviously grown in 3 dimensions, but a huge amount of growth when conditions are right. So at the bottom right are the turions, subterranean turions or tubers. So again, that is the really difficult challenge to hydrilla once it's established. It does grow faster than native plants with dense biomass. That biomass can outcompete native vegetation. It can reduce habitat quantity and quality. It can inhibit recreational activities, clog drinking water intakes, and there is an avian disease link to a cyanobacteria that prefers to grow on hydrilla foliage. So in 2012, we were asked to do a survey of full lake vegetation survey of Lake Waccamaw because hydrilla did suddenly appear there. We sampled about 362 points. If the red dots show up on the left, 45 of those points had hydrilla. We were able to create the map on the right that essentially encompassed the hydrilla area. And we estimated there to be about 608 acres of hydrilla in Lake Waccamaw at that point. And soon after that, management program was taken that would manage around 900 acres for hydrilla. We're not going to go through all this table, but at the top, you can see hydrilla over time in Lake Waccamaw. In 2012, there was approximately 45 vegetated points that did decrease to 0 once management was implemented. Management was very successful, and only in 2017 did we find 3 points of hydrilla, and really no points since then. You can see the other vegetation that was present in Lake Waccamaw. There's not time to run through that, but as you can see, the vegetation did persist but change over time. In 2017, hydrilla suddenly appeared in White Lake, and we were asked to survey that. Approximately 202 points were sampled, and 169 out of those 202 points had hydrilla in 2017. The map on the right shows estimated biovolume or plant height based on sonar scans. Typically, White Lake does have vegetation. That vegetation does grow very low in the water column. And here's a similar table to White Lake vegetation over time. At the top, you see hydrilla. One of the distinguishing factors in White Lake compared to a lot of other lakes is that hydrilla appeared suddenly and then it dropped down to essentially background noise. Typically, when hydrilla gets established, especially in Piedmont reservoirs, it spreads and occupies a fairly large percentage of the littoral zone in those water bodies. In White Lake, it was just the opposite. It popped up all of a sudden, very widespread in the lake, and then again disappeared to just essentially background noise. The image on the right is typically what we're finding in lake surveys now in White Lake, individual plants or plant fragments, not enough out there really for a large concern, and what you find you can pull out of the water with your hand. So very different response in hydrilla growth in White Lake compared to a lot of our other water bodies. And there, of course, is also in this table is all the other vegetation that we found in White Lake. But again, in the essence of time, we're not going to go through that. So to keep things fairly speedy, just to summarize, management activities at Lake Waccamaw for hydrilla have successfully controlled the infestation. We have also been monitoring the hydrilla tuber bank by sampling the sediment, and tuber numbers are down to essentially non-detectable levels right now. We haven't found those since 2017. Hydrilla, again, has not been able to establish a self-sustaining population of White Lake. There probably likely are some tubers out there, but they're not in enough concentration to find through sediment sampling, so we're not finding those. Probably just some individuals that will sprout and maybe replenish themselves, but not enough of a population to really grow and expand. So again, it is likely that it's in White Lake at very low levels, but just not at levels that sampling can detect. So I'll just stop there. And
White Lake is a, thank you.
Got a little bit more time.
10
Be
minutes,
good
all
for you.
right.
Very good. You got about 5.
White Lake is a very interesting bay lake, especially its phytoplankton community. And so today I want to share with you a little bit about what we've learned about the dynamics of the phytoplankton community since 2017 and how, as a whole, the phytoplankton,
Make sure you got your mic.
is it not on?
No, it's on. You just got to
I'm
get a
not.
little closer to you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
You're good.
No, I got too much. I'll need another hand to do that. How as a whole, thanks. How as a whole, the community reflects the ecosystem dynamics. White Lake is a unique ecosystem, as Diane alluded to earlier. It's generally dominated during the summer months by desmids. Desmids have been placed in the kingdom Plantae, and they've also been moved into the phylum Chaerophyta. Diane mentioned Chara and Nitella earlier. That's the phylum that the desmids have been moved into now, because it's been learned that the desmids are more closely related to the higher plants than they really are to other protists. And it's also been found that the desmids have as much value, equal value as environmental indicators as the diatoms do. And this is because, as with the diatoms, many of the desmids have very specific ecological demands and species-specific regional distributions. So some of these species commonly found in White Lake include Cosmerium tinctum, there it is up at the top, Starodesmus triangularis below that, Starastrum cutaceus, and Gonadazygon revesoni. Prior to 2013, again, as Diane has alluded to earlier, White Lake was known for its high clarity, its low pH, and relatively low nutrient meso-oligotrophic status. And you can see actually that area in the photo called Camp Clearwater. That tells you how much it was known for that. Rich desmid flora are expected in these slightly acid, soft, oligotrophic waters like we typically find in the natural lakes in eastern North Carolina. And here you see on the right a representative taxon here, a representative beautiful desmid called Microsterius radiosa. And this particular species was a typical representative of this type of environment in White Lake. Microsterias has a high sensitivity to aquatic contaminants. So yes, it was a representative historically, but now I rarely see it in samples. So it is a rather sensitive indicator. However, if you've heard from the other speakers that the ecosystem of the lake has changed. And in fact, here you can see with the pH graph, there was, and as Nathan had said with the nitrogen, there seems to have been an inflection point around the early 2000s where the pH and the nitrogen levels increased and also rainfall patterns changed. And thus there was gradual eutrophication, and that led to an altered desmid community with periodic blooms of some of the more mesotrophic tolerant desmid species. Now, in fact, the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality did a special study on White Lake from 2015 to 2017. And they also were able to, during that time, they developed a trophic state index model for White Lake. And they also confirmed that there was a transition to a mesotrophic eutrophic status around the time of 2013, which was about the same time as the first documented bloom that Diane spoke of earlier. So there we have the first documented bloom, there was at least identified to genus at that time, Cosmarium. And also the DEQ folks documented dominance of Gonatozygon brivissoni in the summer of 2017. Now, Gonatozygon does tend to thrive in warmer higher nutrient conditions. However, as again, Diane has mentioned earlier, in August of the same year, 2017, there was a shift toward what would become a prolonged bloom of filamentous cyanobacteria. Here you can see one taxon, Planctolingbia limnetica, and also a Phanozomenon. Now, a summer development of Planctolingbia is not too surprising. Is to be expected in some of the more eutrophic water bodies in North Carolina. But what was surprising was, as Diane mentioned earlier, the persistence of this bloom through the winter into May of 2018. And here you see on the left the Phanozomenon, and note the special cell right there, the heterocyst or heterocyte, that is the site of nitrogen fixation. On the left, you can note the high levels of biovolume for both of these taxa in May of 2018. But on May 3rd, again, as Diane has mentioned, a treatment of aluminum sulfate and sodium aluminate was applied to the lake in order to sequester phosphorus from the water column. So also note the very abrupt attenuation in biovolume of both those cyanobacterial taxa after that time. And here's another look at 2018 on the left, and where we can see that moving into the summer of 2018, the eukaryotes returned to dominance, both the desmids and also a chrysophyte here, Denobrion. During the period from late 2018 to 2020, there was alternating dominance of some of the desmids, Starastrum, Starodesmus, and Cosmarium, and even a brief small spike of a haptophyte flagellate up here called Chrysochromulina. In early 2021, there was a brief spike of Cosmarium tinctum. However, as you see on the right, Cosmarium was succeeded in dominance by Gonatozygon, which has remained at a fairly high level of dominance even into February 22, right here. So, and also the blue points refer to a little bit of a resurgence of a phenomenon. But the interesting point about that is that even though it did have a resurgence in the summer of 2021, it really did not reach dominance in the assemblage during 2021. So there are a few conclusions that I think we can draw from this. Lake clarity here in the center has generally increased since 2017. In fact, we can see the result on the right here, such that a mid-lake Secchi-Dex reading in May 2021 showed the highest clarity for the year. And also it appears that interspecific competition has increased nicely since 2017, even with the gradual eutrophication that we see that has gone on. So that at this time, it appears that we have a very diverse and resilient phytoplankton community. Did I make it?
Yeah.
Good job.
You did fine. Diane keeps us to about 5 minutes. We'll be home.
See, it's because I've known you so long, Linda, that I can give you a hard time, right?